Russian forces are stepping up their attacks on towns and cities across Ukraine. The strikes are hitting military and civilian targets. The assaults come ahead of a new round of talks between Ukrainian and Russian negotiators expected to start in the next hour or so. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says citizens have no choice but to keep up their resistance despite the heavy loss of life.
A visit to boost morale. Ukraine's president met wounded soldiers recovering in a Kyiv military hospital. Volodymyr Zelensky handed out medals in recognition of their bravery. Though Russian forces appear to be widening their attacks across Ukraine, Zelensky vowed ultimate victory, and he indicated progress could be made as bilateral talks continue. Representatives of our countries are holding daily talks via video conference. Our delegation has a clear task to do everything to arrange the meeting of the presidents. The meeting, I'm sure, people are waiting for. Obviously, this is a difficult story, a hard path, but we need this path. On Sunday, Moscow brought its war nearer to the Polish border. An attack on a military training ground near Lviv in western Ukraine was the closest strike so far to NATO territory. Civilians from all over Ukraine have been fleeing to Lviv, which felt safe compared to eastern regions under Russian assault. Now the city, which is listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, is taking steps to protect its cultural treasures. In an attempt to offer diversion from the horrors of war, volunteers have organized tours around the town for people displaced by the fighting.
I want to distract myself from war, to think like it's fine, but I know it's not. It's not fine right now at Kharkiv, and I'm really worried for my friends and my professors.
If I have to judge what is happening now in Ukraine, it's comparable to the destruction of Guernica, of Stalingrad, and with the siege of Leningrad. History is repeating itself with all its nightmares. Nightmares that reached the northern outskirts of the capital, Kyiv, on Monday morning. Emergency services say a 9-story apartment building was hit in a Russian artillery strike, killing at least 2 people.
Well, let's cross now to DW's Nick Connolly, who's standing by in the capital, Kyiv. Nick, new talks scheduled today. Is there any reason for Ukrainians to be hopeful?
I fear not a great deal. This is about the optics. It's about neither side being able to be seen not to be open to talks. Russia wants to somehow slightly reduce the toxicity of this attack on Ukraine and show that it's open to diplomacy. But if you look at the red lines, at what Russia is still trying to achieve here in Ukraine, still getting signals from Russia that they want Ukraine to abandon ambitions to join NATO, to basically give up on its army and be perpetually vulnerable and open to Russian intervention. They want Ukraine to recognize Russian ownership of annexed Crimea and also to recognize those self-proclaimed republics in the east. It's very difficult to see how President Zelensky could go back to his people now after weeks of war and thousands of dead and explain to them why he is going along with this if Ukraine has already brought such great sacrifices.
Nick, officials where you are in Kyiv say they're preparing food supplies for the city's remaining 2 million inhabitants in case of a siege. What is the situation where you are?
Well, for now, that siege situation that we've been expecting for weeks hasn't happened yet. Basically, people here in Kyiv have been living with the kind of news reports every couple of days saying it's just another few days until the Russians close that ring around Kyiv and prevent food and backup coming in. That hasn't happened so far. There are still 2 major highways to the southwest and the south that are open, and you can still even order things online, supplies, medicines, but even toiletries, other things online. They come within a couple of days from the west of the country. So extraordinary logistics happening here and no sign of empty supermarket shelves. But yes, the authorities have said that they are preparing because they do believe the Russians do want to encircle Kyiv and to put that pressure on the Ukrainian government. So they are prepared for 2 weeks should that situation that we've seen in Mariupol repeat itself here in Kyiv, just on a much bigger scale.
On Sunday, Russia attacked a military target in the far west of the country in striking distance of NATO territory. How significant an attack was that?
This was important in two ways. This was about showing Ukrainians that there is no safe hinterland, there is nowhere to go that is not accessible and destroyable by Russian force. These missiles were launched from Russian planes, we believe, that were flying above the Black Sea, cruise missiles, and about 35 people, we now understand, lost their lives. They're mainly military people. But this was just a matter of kilometers away from the border crossings to Poland that have seen hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians queuing for kilometers in front of those border crossing points. So a real sense of vulnerability there. But this is also a clear signal to NATO. This was a training ground where NATO troops, or at least NATO member country troops from America, UK, other countries, were training Ukrainian forces to use those Western weapons that have proved so successful for the Ukrainians in recent weeks. So that training ground as kind of proxy for Western support for Ukraine. We've heard Vladimir Putin in recent days saying if more significant weaponry comes in from the West, then Russia will attack those shipments, those supplies, and basically we'll see any country aiming to help Ukraine as a party to this conflict. So a very clear attempt to try and scare off Western support for Ukraine, and a sense here that, yeah, this is now a country that is at war along its basically 3,000-kilometer border with Russia and Belarus.
Now, places in the south that are now under Russian control, such as the city of Kherson, we're seeing people fighting back. What's the situation there in those occupied towns?
We've seen some extraordinary images on social media of people going out to protest in spite of Russian military control of those cities, in spite of attempts to create kind of proxy states of the kind we saw in Donetsk and Luhansk back in 2014. Ukrainian politicians, the local politicians, not going along with it. The attempt to create a so-called Kherson People's Republic that we saw over the weekend failing because basically the elected Ukrainian officials just wouldn't go along with it despite a lot of pressure being applied to them. Ordinary people getting out on the streets with Ukrainian flags, in some cases clambering on Russian tanks with Ukrainian flags and telling those Russian soldiers to go home. We've seen the Russian authorities getting progressively more aggressive towards those protesters, firing into the air. We've heard of arrests. A Ukrainian mayor in Melitopol was kidnapped by the Russian forces, and they've put now their own proxy person in charge. But definitely, I think, a lot more in the way of resistance and willingness to take risks from the ordinary kind of residential population of those cities than the Russians certainly bargained for.
Well, Nick, thank you very much for that update. DW's Nick Connolly in Kyiv. Here are some other developments in the conflict now. Authorities in Ukraine's besieged port city of Mariupol say the city is running out of its last reserves of food and water. They also accuse Russian forces of continuing to shell non-military targets. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is urging the Russian military to allow a convoy with medical aid and food into the city. Police across Russia have arrested more than 800 people for protesting the invasion. Moscow authorities say they detained 300 people for breaching public order. Police also arrested dozens in St. Petersburg, as well as 30 other cities. Internet traffic monitors say the social media platform Instagram has been restricted across Russia. State regulators blocked the platform after its owner Meta said it would allow users in Ukraine to call for violence against Russian soldiers. Moscow had already blocked Facebook, also owned by Meta. A US journalist has been killed while reporting near Kyiv. Brent Renault was travelling to film refugees fleeing the town of Irpin when his vehicle came under fire. Another journalist was wounded in the attack, which Ukraine blames on Russian forces.
This footage shows the moments after two journalists were shot in Irpin. Juan Arredondo was wounded and brought to a hospital where he recounted what had happened.
We crossed the first bridge in Irpin. We were going to film other refugees leaving, and we got into a car. Somebody offered to take us to the other bridge, and we crossed a checkpoint, and they started shooting at us. So the driver turned around, and they kept shooting. It's two of us. My friend is Brent Renault, and he's been shot and left behind.
Arredondo didn't yet know that Renault, a 50-year-old award-winning documentary filmmaker, had died at the scene. Ukrainian officials blamed Russian forces for the shooting. Several media crews have come under fire since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Renault is believed to be the first foreign journalist to be killed. Irpin, a suburb about 20 kilometres outside Kyiv, has been under heavy bombardment as Russian armoured vehicles advance towards Ukraine's capital. Thousands of people are fleeing in dangerous conditions. Some evacuees have come under fire, but staying is also terrifying.
It is war, just war. Our building was hit with a missile and 2 apartments next to ours were just smashed. We've got cases of looting. It's just horrible. Very, very horrible. Something went through the air and then boom. All the windows were broken and the balcony fell down. And the 10th floor above us was just dust. My daughter came and said, "Mama, take your stuff." Until this, I didn't want to leave my town.
The refugees hope to find relative safety away from their hometown, rendered uninhabitable by the fighting.